So what happens when a key ally launches a huge military strike without asking America for permission first? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into. We're about to take a raw look at the power dynamics shaking the Middle East and what it all tells us about a 30-year American-led order that might just be cracking right in front of us.
Yeah, this is the central question, isn't it? It's not really about pointing fingers, but about understanding the cold, hard logic that has brought the U.S. to a cliff edge that very few people even saw coming. Answering this is absolutely crucial to getting a handle on the dangerous new reality on the ground.
All right, here's how we're going to connect the dots. First, we'll look at the single event that cracked the American order. Then we'll see how that spiraled into a whole new kind of war, which then forced a political response that pulled in global powers. And finally, we'll look at the terrifying endgame all of this seems to be pointing toward.
So it all kicked off with a single military strike. But this wasn't just any strike. It was a direct challenge to the entire U.S. strategy in the Middle East since the Cold War. A strategy that was built on one very simple core idea. America calls the shots.
This all comes down to what we call raw power logic. I mean, think about it. When one of your closest allies feels like they can launch a major military operation without even asking you for a green light, well, that's a pretty clear signal that your influence is fading, fast. The illusion of control, it's just gone.
So how did this happen? Well, Washington was in these super delicate talks with Tehran about its nuclear program. Then, pretty suddenly, the U.S. toughened its stance, which basically signaled to Iran that the talks were a joke. And it was right in that moment, in that window of diplomatic chaos, that Israel launched its strike. They saw an opportunity to act, and they took it.
Now, Israel was expecting a swift, knockout victory. But what they got instead was a brutal lesson in a new type of war. A war of attrition that they were completely fundamentally unprepared to fight.
Okay, this is so crucial to understand. For decades, America and Israel have measured power in things like F-35 stealth fighters and precision bombs. But Iran spent 20 years building a totally different kind of military. Theirs is all about huge numbers of low-cost missiles, spreading everything out, and just being able to take a punch and keep on fighting.
And the results of that strategy were devastatingly effective. See, Iran pretty much bypassed a direct military fight. Instead, they went after the weak points in Israel's economy, the ports, the fuel depots, the supply chains. The goal was to just bleed the country out, economically and psychologically, until it just couldn't fight anymore.
The sheer scale of it was just overwhelming. Israel's famous air defense systems, they were designed to handle small waves of rockets, right? Not a continuous, relentless storm of hundreds of missiles day after day after day. The system was simply drowned by the sheer volume.
And here's where the math gets absolutely brutal. To guarantee you'll shoot down one incoming missile, which is relatively cheap, you often have to fire 2 of your own multi-million-dollar interceptors. You can see how fast that becomes a losing game, financially.
And this was the number that sent a wave of panic through the highest levels of government. At that rate of fire, both the Israeli and the supporting U.S. Navy stockpiles of interceptors would be completely empty in less than 2 weeks. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming.
This analogy right here just perfectly captures the whole strategic failure. For decades, Israel believed its superior air force was like an invincible weapon. But in this new era of cheap, long-range missiles, that beautiful high-tech samurai sword turned out to be totally useless against a massive artillery barrage.
So, with its key ally on the ropes and facing a potential collapse, America was forced to do something. But here's the twist. The decision about what to do wasn't driven by some grand strategy. Oh no, it was driven by the intense pressures of domestic politics back home.
This was the inevitable turning point. As soon as Israel realized it could not win this war of attrition by itself, it did what it always does when it's cornered. It turned to Washington and demanded a direct, decisive intervention, pulling the U.S. right into the heart of the crisis.
This put the U.S. president in a terrible political trap. I mean, the American public is completely exhausted with new wars, and a full-scale conflict would send oil prices through the roof. So the question became, how do you look strong and help your ally without getting dragged into some massive, uncontrollable war?
And the answer? It was one of the most politically calculated military moves in recent memory. A limited strike, one that was reportedly even communicated to Iran ahead of time, designed purely so the president could go on TV and declare a victory, without actually changing anything on the ground. It was a show of force with no real force behind it.
But a fire like this, it doesn't stay contained.
It quickly became part of a much bigger story, a story about a shrinking American presence and the other global powers that are rushing in to fill that vacuum.
You have to see how this single conflict is connected to all these other flashpoints. Gaza is still the emotional detonator for the entire Arab world, Syria is a chaotic battleground for regional powers, Turkey is expanding its influence north, and watching it all, you have Russia and China moving in to protect their own interests.
So the big picture stakes are pretty clear. The US and Israel want to contain Iran, but for Russia and China, Iran is a critical strategic buffer. For Russia, it blocks Western influence. For China, it's a vital energy partner. The bottom line is they will simply not allow Iran to collapse.
And this gets us to the real heart of the matter. What started as a regional fight is now exposing the limits of American power on a global stage. As other great powers step in to back their allies, the US just can't dictate the outcome the way it used to.
So for our final section, we get to the most dangerous consequence of this new reality. A world where the simple logic of survival is pushing more and more countries toward the ultimate weapon. Now, to an American audience, a quote like this might just sound like tough talk, but to any leader in the Middle East, that is a direct existential threat, because every single one of them knows exactly what happened to Libya.
Let's just remember the story. In 2003, Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program in exchange for peace and international acceptance. Less than a decade later, with no ultimate weapon left to protect him, his regime was overthrown and he was killed in the street. That is the grim lesson that has burned into the mind of every single leader in that region.
And that leaves us here with this one final critical question. The ultimate danger for a superpower like the United States isn't necessarily losing a big battle. It's being slowly bled dry by long, drawn-out conflicts where it has no clear goal. Wars that, when you get right down to it, are not its own. And you have to wonder, is that the path America is on right now?